Good afternoon again. My name is Kim, and we're just about to get started. I want to thank everyone who's already dialed in. I see some familiar names and I see some new names, so we're so grateful you've taken the time to join us today. Again, my name is Kim. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Reeve Foundation. It's my privilege to welcome you to our June, my goodness, we're in June, advocacy update. I know it's been a while since we last met virtually, and we have a lot to go over. I want to say in the meantime, we're so grateful for all your continued advocacy and dedication to the foundation in advancing its advocacy priorities and its mission. So as you'll see in the chat, we are able to accept questions in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to monitor them throughout the webinar. We'll also have time at the end for questions. This webinar is being recorded. We'll be happy. We're posting it on the Reeve Foundation YouTube channel, and Chris will also send it out to all registrants, including the slides. I also wanted to add that we've reached out to many of the regional champions for feedback on how we can improve our program, and I want to thank them for taking the time to give us some wonderful feedback. And we're going to do our best to implement some of your suggestions so we can continue to expand our work and also make this a better experience for everybody. So let's get started. Today's agenda. Well, I'll introduce my fellow panelists. We'll talk a little bit about what's been happening on the legislative front since we last met, some updates around COVID-19 relief, I'm sure you've been reading a lot of the legislation, proposed legislation, the President Biden administration and Democrats have proposed in the House and the Senate. So we'll go over that. We'll talk a little bit about vaccines. And then of course, we'll go into our congressional update and we'll talk about the FY22 appropriations process. I know many of you have been helping us begin the advocacy around ensuring that members of Congress know about the Paralysis Resource Center. We're constantly reminded from our friends on the Hill that they love hearing from everyone. And so we'll go over the timeline and what we can expect for the rest of the year. And then Chris, we're really excited to welcome one of our fantastic advocates, Felicia Gibson. We'll talk a little bit about the summit. I hope many of you have been able to attend it and some new updates that Chris has. And we also are thrilled to welcome back Chris Carson to our team again. And again, I'm Kim. We'll have Felicia and John from We're So Grateful to continue to work with Waxman Strategies. And of course, Chris, who many of you know and work with on a daily basis. So I think our next speaker is Felicia.
Thanks so much, Kim, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this afternoon's Regional Champions webinar. One of the things that I'm hoping to do is give a COVID-19 overview and summary, and hopefully this will be one of the last ones that we'll be giving since we are trying to approach a sense of normalcy again in our response to COVID-19 and vaccination rates. So we'll start off with an overview of the American Rescue Plan. This was a bill that was passed through a reconciliation process in which it just requires a majority vote in the Senate and was signed into law in early March. It was about a $2 trillion package that included the $1,400 stimulus checks that many individual Americans received based on their income. There was funding for community vaccination sites around the US and for vaccine distribution, which was a really important push from the Biden administration, as well as funding for education and small businesses and funding that went towards home and community-based services through Medicaid. So that was one of the really big packages this year. And I'll go into an overview of all of the sort of COVID-19 bills that have been passed to date. If we go to the next slide. And so these are the bills that have been passed so far. So it started off with the CARES Act in March of 2020. That, of course, was signed into law by former President Trump. That had $1,200 stimulus checks for individuals. There was an unemployment insurance of $600 per week, as well as additional funding for education and small businesses. And that's where we start to see that funding going towards COVID-19 tests, and vaccine development with that $25 billion investment. And so the CARES Act was a little over $2 trillion. And then there was a follow-up COVID-19 bill that was passed in December 2020, known as the Response and Relief Act. This one additionally had those stimulus checks, $600 for individuals. There was a decrease, though, in the unemployment insurance, down from $600 per week to $300 per week. Again, there was additional funding for education and small businesses, and we see that there's also this increase in the COVID-19 testing funds and vaccine funding. If everyone remembers too, this was the start in December of 2020, this was the start of that emergency use authorization from the FDA for some of those initial vaccines that people were able to get that was available to the public. So that's where we start to see that uptick and that funding there. And then of course, as I just mentioned, the American Rescue Plan passed in this past March with the stimulus checks of $1,400 for everyone based on income. That continuation of the unemployment insurance at $300 per week, funding for education and small businesses again, and we see a really big increase in the funding for testing and vaccine distribution. And this was really important in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, trying to make the vaccines as accessible as possible and really move that out there. And so one piece of this access piece actually goes into COVID-19 vaccine access for people with disabilities. And so this, there was guidance that was provided from a combination of places, OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, as well as the Administration for Community Living, ACL, and the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation published a number of resources and guidelines to really improve the access to vaccines for people with disabilities and older adults as well. And so in the use of those guidelines, it really wanted to make it very clear and outline that under the federal civil rights laws, there can't be any discrimination against people with disabilities. It should be absolutely accessible for everyone to get the access to the vaccines that they need. And this really helped to improve that access to vaccines. And so we can move on to this next part now, where there's a bigger vaccination update. There's a new campaign that's being launched known as the Made to Save vaccine campaign. And so this is a mobilization campaign from the White House that's being launched by the White House. And it's really meant to ensure that we can get to that 70% of US adults at least partially vaccinated by the 4th of July. And so it's really meant to start at the end of this week and go into the following month. Right now, within the United States, there's about 50% of US adults that are at least partially vaccinated. So there really is an opportunity there for that increase, but there has been challenges. Now it's about reaching out to many US adults that are a little bit more hesitant about getting the vaccine for a number of reasons. And so this campaign is really meant to allow every American that's interested in receiving a vaccine should be able to have access to it. And there's also more information related to the campaign as well. So if you go to madetosave.org, you'll see more information related to that campaign, as well as opportunities to join online and in-person events and receive resources on how to communicate opportunities for people to get the vaccine and help in alleviating any hesitancy that people may have as well. And so I'm excited that we were able to give that COVID-19 update, because it does seem like it is moving in the right direction. And so I will pass it over to John now to give congressional updates.
Great. Thank you so much, Felicia, and thanks to Kim and Chris and to everyone who's joined the call today. We know that you all have a lot of opportunities to do a lot of different things and busy lives, especially as things do slightly, slowly, bit by bit, start to return to some sense of pre-pandemic normalcy. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and talk about advocacy. So I wanted to build off of what Felicia has talked about. She's really spoken to what has happened so far this year, including what major legislation has passed related to COVID-19 and related to our community. And so I wanted to build on that by really looking a little bit at sort of what is coming down the pike legislatively over the course of the rest of the year. So you probably have been, if you've been following the news, heard the term infrastructure thrown around quite a lot. Infrastructure is sort of the umbrella term that the administration and congressional leaders are using to describe a pretty wide-ranging set of legislative proposals that have come from the administration and that will be debated in Congress really over the course of the summer and the fall. The first element in that was the president's American Jobs Plan. This is a nearly $2.3 trillion proposal to really focused on infrastructure and jobs investment over the course of the next 8 years. And you can see here some of the breakdown in how the jobs plan was structured. Again, this is a proposal. It's not gone into law. Congress will need to really start diving into the details and putting it all together and seeing what they can pass. But there's a significant emphasis not just on traditional infrastructure as we might think about it, like roads, bridges, transportation, public transit, et cetera, but really on the human infrastructure as well. And in the jobs plan, the piece of that I think is most striking and that we're focused on the most directly is a proposal to increase the federal investment in home and community-based care by about $400 billion. So that's a really generational shift in the level of resources being dedicated to home and community-based care, a system of care that within Medicaid in particular really is designed to meet the needs of the aging population as well as the population of people with disabilities to receive care in their homes. And there's a real emphasis in this proposal on paying adequate rates to the workforce that actually provides that care, as well as obviously investing in the infrastructure of that care itself. So that's a big piece of this overall infrastructure plan that we will be tracking. Secondly, the administration released what is known as the American Families Plan. And while those details aren't laid out here on a slide, we can just go over briefly. The Families Plan is really sort of doubling down on that human infrastructure piece. So that's where they have proposals related to paid leave, related to childcare, related to early education and other education investments, as well as in the rescue plan, some of the subsidies for Affordable Care Act coverage were increased and made available to more people. And the American Families Plan would make those subsidies permanent. So one of the really big questions with both of these plans, sort of under that umbrella of infrastructure, is how much of this will be able to pass Congress? Will these go through Congress as one piece of legislation, as two pieces of legislation? Will it get broken up into more than two pieces of legislation? And one of the other factors is, will there be able to be some level of bipartisan agreement, if not on the entire package, on certain parts of it that may, traditionally have had support from both sides of the aisle? And so what is going on now are negotiations, including today, between the White House, President Biden, and senators of both parties, led by Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, who is really leading the efforts to see if there is a possible common ground on infrastructure that the Republicans in the Senate and the House, Democrats in the Senate and the House, and the White House can get together on. In either scenario, whether or not there is a subset of these proposals that's agreed upon on a bipartisan basis, we still expect that Democratic leaders in the Senate and the House will push ahead with whatever is not in that bipartisan agreement. So potentially the home and community-based care piece, childcare, paid leave, and some of the other proposals, healthcare related proposals, they will likely still move ahead with that on a partisan basis, so with Democrat only votes. One of the things that means, and Celicia referenced this earlier, is that at least some of this is likely to have to go through a process that's called budget reconciliation. And without diving too deeply into the really wonky details of that, budget reconciliation is a process you can use once and actually now twice a year. It means that you can pass legislation with a simple majority in the Senate. Most legislation at this point requires 60 votes to overcome a filibuster in the Senate, but budget reconciliation legislation does not require that. But there are limitations on what kinds of provisions can go into that legislation. And it has to be mostly provisions that either spend money or affect taxes, so that things that are directly budgetary in nature. You couldn't, for instance, pass election reform through budget reconciliation. And there's some question of whether you could pass immigration reform through budget reconciliation. By and large, it has to be things that are strictly and specifically related to the budget. So there are, I think it's fair to say at this stage, a lot of open questions about how these proposals will move forward. Speaker Pelosi in the House has said that she wants the House to have weighed in on this before and taken votes before Congress recesses in August. Senator Schumer, the Senate leader, has made similar comments, but I think there's also an expectation that because of the size and scope and complexity of a lot of this legislation, it could actually fall or slip into the fall in terms of when it gets passed. So this is something we'll be monitoring really closely and keeping folks informed about. I'll talk in a minute about the appropriations process, which is the annual budget process, which is sort of running in parallel to this process. But I think it's important to really focus this time, at least, on sort of what has been proposed under infrastructure and how do we see that playing out. So the next thing I wanted to highlight is a couple of appointments that have been made at the Department of Health and Human Services since our last conversation with the regional champions. So two really important positions that have now been filled are the Deputy Secretary of HHS and the CMS Administrator. CMS is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So we spoke on a previous webinar about how the HHS Secretary was nominated and had been confirmed. That's former California Attorney General and former Congressman Javier Becerra. He was confirmed earlier this year as overseeing all of HHS. Andrea Palm was confirmed in April with substantial support in the Senate to be Deputy Secretary of HHS. And this is a really crucial position because it's sort of the day-to-day manager of that, massive government department. It's sort of the chief operating officer of HHS, who is really responsible for making sure that all the different pieces from ACL, which we're familiar with, to CMS, which runs Medicare and Medicaid, to HRSA, which runs a number of community-based programs, the FDA, any CDC, NIH, the Deputy Secretary really has to be atop all of those different operating divisions and making sure that they are working in tandem and working towards the larger goals of the agency. The other really substantial and really important appointment that was made and nominated and finally voted on actually just last week is Chiquita Brooks LaSure to be the administrator of CMS. And again, I think within HHS, CMS is at well over half of the total budget of HHS. Medicare and Medicaid as well as the Affordable Care Act are covered under CMS. And so the person in charge of these programs has a lot of discretion and a lot of power over the way that those programs operate, what's covered, what's not, what kinds of reforms are undertaken within Medicare and Medicaid. And so these are two longtime health policy experts from within Washington. Both, I think, have worked in previous administrations as well as on Capitol Hill. And so we're looking forward to working with them, as well as, of course, with our friends at ACL as things go forward. So I mentioned earlier that even as this entire infrastructure legislation and some other issues are being debated in the House and Senate, there is also the annual appropriations process. And just for a refresher for those who are new to these calls or who haven't been on calls in the past, appropriations is the process by which Congress allocates funding for federal programs on an annual basis. It covers almost all federal programs, technically what are called discretionary programs, so programs that are funded through annual funding from the government. There are other programs called mandatory programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, SNAP, and other programs along those lines that are known as, to some, as entitlement programs, but the appropriations process really covers sort of the funding levels on an annual basis for thousands of federal programs. One of those federal programs is near and dear to all of our hearts, which is the Paralysis Resource Center, funded by and overseen by the Administration for Community Living and operated by the Reeve Foundation through a competitive grant process since 2002. And so one of the things that we do on the advocacy side is make known support and try and build support for funding for the PRC within the appropriations process and every year. So the Paralysis Resource Center is currently funded at about $9.7 million per year. That's a funding level set by Congress and implemented by the administration. And one of the ways that support is built within the appropriations process is through what are called Dear Colleague letters. And these are letters that are led by, in our case, a bipartisan team of members of the House, Representative Langevin and Representative Fitzpatrick. They circulate a sign-on letter that says, we support continued funding for the Paralysis Resource Center. That letter gathers signatures from members of Congress and then goes to the appropriations committees so that they know exactly what the level of support is for the program, both within Congress and among advocates. So that letter circulated earlier this year. We got a few fewer signatures than last year, but I think one thing we've heard from contacts on Capitol Hill is that this was the case across the board this year. You know, remember that congressional staff and members are themselves still working remotely by and large. Kim and I had a phone call meeting with one congressional office this morning. And so the channels of communication are not quite as fluid as I think we'd like them to be or as they've been in the past. But that being said, I think, and Chris will speak to this, there's a tremendous grassroots effort that went into asking members to sign on to this letter. And I think we're really pleased to see the number of advocates who really engaged in that process. So just to walk through sort of how does the appropriations process play out, you can see here some of the deadlines that have passed for the signatures on the Langevin Fitzpatrick letter and for members to make requests of the appropriations subcommittee that funds these programs. Traditionally, in most years, the beginning of the federal budget and appropriations process is the release of the president's budget request. In most years, that happens in early February and sort of marks the beginning of the budget process because the president's request sort of lays out what the administration would like to see in terms of funding for all those thousands of programs funded by the appropriations process. In this year, and as is common in first years of new administrations, remember President Biden, as with all presidents, new presidents took office on January 20th. Therefore, they are never able to put together a full budget by the first week in February. That would be only about 10 days or so. So the president's budget this year came out actually on May 28th, last week. What's exciting about that in terms of the president's budget for the Paralysis Resource Center is they actually requested a small increase for the program from about 9.7 billion to about 10.2, or sorry, 9.7 million to about 10.2 million in next year's budget, in the FY22 budget, fiscal year 22 budget. Again, that is the president's budget request is just that, it's a request, it's a proposal. But if the administration has supported an increase in your program, it can go a long way towards helping see that increase actually pass through the appropriations committees and eventually into law. So what we expect coming up over the course of the next couple of months is that the appropriations committees will release their draft legislation that with funding levels for all of these bills, and then they'll do what's called marking up the bills. And that's not just doodling in the margins, it's actually voting on amendments and proposing amendments and changes to funding so that they can make statements about what differing priorities are. Those markups are happening over the course of the next couple of months. Then we expect that committees will pass their legislation out of committee. And after that, it gets a little bit fuzzy. So one thing in the appropriations process is that the end of the federal fiscal year is October 1st, technically September 30th at midnight. And if Congress doesn't pass the final appropriations bills that lay out funding levels for all the various federal programs by that September 30th deadline, they have a couple of options. One is they can basically put the government on autopilot and extend current funding with what's called a continuing resolution, basically a piece of legislation that they pass that says everything will keep going as it is for a period of time, and the legislation sets that period of time. If they can't get agreement even on a continuing resolution, that's when we've had in the past government shutdowns. So I think the general expectation this year is that they will not finish the appropriations process on time by September 30th, that we are likely to see a continuing resolution extending funding probably into November, December, and then likely there will be a large year-end package that pulls together both the appropriations bills and potentially some of the infrastructure legislation that we referenced earlier. So it's an interesting point in the year because there are some knowns. We know what the president's budget says. We know what has already passed as part of the rescue plan, but there are a lot of unknowns in terms of where the appropriations process goes from here, how that intersects with the infrastructure bill, what's ultimately included there. And remember that there are very, very, very close margins in terms of the partisan split between Democrats and Republicans in both the Senate, where it's a 50-50 margin with Vice President Harris breaking the tie, and in the House, where Democrats can really only lose about 4 or 5 votes before they don't hold the majority on any particular piece of legislation. So that's complicating things even more. There's not a lot of wiggle room here to push things through. So both sides and both chambers are really working towards finding some consensus and seeing where there are opportunities to go with the rest of the year. So with that, I will hand it back over to Chris to talk about how we can all get involved.
Sure, I can get started. I want to acknowledge a friend of the foundation with whom we've worked for many years, Dr. Anjali Pratt, who's recently named the director of the National Institute on Disability Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, otherwise known as NIDLR. And we are just thrilled that she has been nominated to this very prestigious position, and this institute lives within ACL. So we're really excited that she will continue her work as a disability advocate and an evaluation expert and a research expert. She previously was a professor. She has a long, amazing resume and CV, both in disability rights and as an academic at Vanderbilt University. We're really thrilled that the Biden administration has recently named her. She just started this past week. We will continue to be able to work with her. And I believe she and her service dog, I'm not exactly sure, but she may find herself in Washington, DC soon enough. So congratulations to Dr. Pratt. And Chris, before you get started with this, I wanted to acknowledge one question that I saw in the chat box before we continue, if you don't mind, if we can address this. Where is it? Someone inquired, and I want to make sure that I think I understand the question. Someone asked, I think in reference to some of the legislation that Celicia and John were reviewing, if some of those proposals include paid spousal care. And I want to thank you for that question. And if I understand correctly, I think what you're asking is if home and community-based services funding, if individuals can use funding or those services to pay their spouse or a family caregiver as a paid caregiver. If I think that's the question, and if I'm not correct, please correct me. But from what I understand, obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with this, depending on who the payer is. So if it's through Medicaid or the VA, those are the two that I'm very familiar with. I'm not exactly sure. I think it's case by case for commercial payers. And then for Medicare, I'd have to look into that. But for Medicaid, it's based on each state's rules, from what I understand. And I understand that some states allow that and other states do not. And I also understand that some states, you can apply for a waiver in order to allow your family caregiver to be paid through those supports. So I know that's a very vague answer. I will say a couple things. If you're able to submit where you live, although I think I can look that up, I'm happy to follow up with you on that question. And secondly, Chris will talk a little bit later on about another webinar we're having that will focus solely on home and community-based services. That'll go into much more detail because we've received a lot of questions about this. And I want to make sure that we're able to educate all of you in more detail. So I've invited an expert from the ARC of the US to come and sort of address these questions head on. So if we're not able to get your question answered before then, I certainly encourage everyone to join that webinar. So I just wanted to answer that, Chris, before you continue.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you, Celicia and John, for those detailed updates on the legislative front. And I also want to thank Felicia Gibson. As Kim mentioned, we have one of our regional champions, Felicia from Savannah, Georgia, is here with us, and she's gonna talk a little bit about her experiences reaching out to the Hill in regards to the Dear Colleague letter this year and some of her other work with the foundation. But before we get to her, I wanted to give you all some updates. John gave that really great detailed explanation of what the appropriations process is like, and we asked you all to take action on the start of this with the Dear Colleague letter recently, and I wanted to let you know how that all turned out. So first of all, to everyone who reached out to their representative to solidify a meeting and who met with those members, we really appreciate that effort. Thank you so much. But we also were working the grassroots on the other front. We had online advocates. They sent 888 letters to just the House of Representatives. Usually when we do these email campaigns, we send to both the House and the Senate. This time we focused only on the House. And that's enough emails to contact every member of the House twice. So in such a short period of time, really mobilized quickly online to get the word out and to urge members to sign on to this Dear Colleague letter. As John mentioned, there was less signatures this year than in last year, but out of our 16 signatures, it was bipartisan support and a great diversity of districts from New Jersey to Washington State. And I'll also mention that of those 16 members, they represent 14 states. So I think that shows, the reach of the program throughout the nation, and that our efforts through our Regional Champions program and our online advocacy is really getting the attention of those on the Hill. So we're at the start of this appropriations process. The follow-up and the next steps for us are, we'd like to ask you to send some testimony from our board chairman, Jay Shepard. We drafted testimony to send to the Appropriations Committee, and I'll be sharing that with all of you and asking you to send that on to your members, to remind them of all of the great work of the Paralysis Resource Center and what the foundation offers. And for those of you who were able to meet with your members and your members signed on, we're going to have a thank you letter that I will also send to you, which we'll ask for you to send on to show the appreciation for your members taking that next step. So that's the update on our Dear Colleague outreach. Again, thank you all for really getting to it and reaching out to the Hill. And next, we had Summit at the end of April. I was so bummed that I couldn't make it as I was on leave, but I heard it was a really great success. It was our first ever virtual summit. We had over 500 attendees, and we were really proud to feature Black Lives Living with Paralysis, listening to survivors of gun violence and health equity. It was a panel discussion on those issues, and we're going to be broadcasting an encore of that discussion on June 16th from 2 to 4 p.m. And one of the participants in that panel is our very own regional champion, Felicia Gibson, who's with us today. Felicia was speaking to her experience as a caregiver for her husband. She's been a regional champion since 2020 and has been doing great work with us. So I'll turn it over to Felicia and let Felicia tell you all a little bit about what she's been doing as a regional champion. Thank you, Felicia.
Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I am Felicia Gibson. Like Chris said, I started becoming a regional champion in 2020. Basically, I found the Reeve Foundation through a Facebook group. I met Kelly with Team Reeve in one of the groups I'm with, and she told me about the Reeve Foundation and all the different things that they do. But before I actually even get into that, I guess I should tell you a little bit about what got me interested in helping out and becoming an advocate for those with mobility issues, paralysis. My husband was paralyzed August 27th, 2018. He was outside with our dog and he saw people breaking into cars in our neighborhood. So being the person that he is, he wanted to see a license plate, so he called the police. However, they decided they didn't want to be caught and they shot at him through the window and struck him in the neck, and he was instantly paralyzed. He is a level C6, C7 quadriplegic. So with that, our lives changed, and I started seeing things a little bit differently. A lot of difficulty adjusting back to life after everything kind of got a little bit more settled and we came back to our normal, air quotes, life. That's why I sought out those Facebook groups, and that's how I met Kelly. She introduced me to Brittany back then. Brittany introduced me to Kim. Kim introduced me to Chris, like everyone else here. And since then, I have just immersed myself in trying to become more active. When I became a regional champion, I was just, the first thing I noticed was parking. I was like, well, what can I do about this? And she said, well, maybe you can get in touch with your local people And then as I kept going through the program, I found out about the Dear Colleague letter, about how I can actually meet with important people within my community and at a federal level, which brings me to how I actually met my representative, Buddy Carter. He was not someone I even thought about reaching out to, but when the appropriations discussion started, I believe last year, they'd said, hey, why don't you meet with your representative, just do a face-to-face, see how it goes, let them know you're out there and that you're willing to work with them. So I did. I basically got all the information from my contacts at the Reeve Foundation, wrote an email, asked for assistance in setting up a meeting. They set that meeting up for me with my local office. I met with Buddy Carter. I met with his field representative in the Savannah area, Matthew Worth. And that honestly is one of the best things I think I could have done, because now I have a direct line to my House of Representatives member. Basically, when it was time to do the letter to ask my representative to sign on for the Dear Colleague letter, I basically just wrote to Matthew because we had a personal experience. I knew that he has the representative's ear, and so I knew that he would get the message to who it needed to get to. And unfortunately, he did not get to sign the Dear Colleague letter this year. They ran out of time. They basically wanted to make sure of all the research before they put their name to something, which is understandable. I'll definitely try and make sure I get in touch with him a little bit sooner for it next year. And I'll actually tell you what he said. Sorry, I'm trying to pull it up on my email. So it was brought to my attention by Kim that his name wasn't on the email. So I just said, hey, was it a clerical error? Just wondering, because you had expressed support about signing on to the Dear Colleague letter, but basically it was so close to the deadline. The legislative team wasn't able to make the research quick enough for the committee. So they couldn't get the congressman's name on it, but they did reach out to the committee to express their support. And they said they will make sure they are on it for next year. So it was an interesting experience. I didn't realize how much goes into all of these legislative letters and the appropriations and everything, but I am very glad that I did reach out to him, because now they know that I will be paying attention and that I will double check and just kind of say, hey, did you get my email? Hey, did you get a chance to look at that? Did you sign on to it? And it shows that they are interested in continuing a relationship with local people here in their community, which honestly is something that's really, really great. I was extremely nervous to get involved, but I do want to say that it is very important to get that face-to-face meeting. I don't think that just an email or call would have necessarily had as much of an impact on the representative and his field representative, because they actually told us that it was one of the most heartfelt meetings they've ever had in their office and that they won't forget it. And that's the sort of thing that people kind of need. They need to put faces with names. They need to see how things are affecting the people that they are supposed to represent. As far as a little bit else about me, I'm not only a regional champion, I've recently become a ambassador to the Paralysis Resource Center. So I talk to different people about the Paralysis Resource Center, what it does, different organizations. I actually have a meeting coming up with my historically Black college coming up in a few weeks to go over resources for them, which is something I had never even thought about until the Reeve Summit, ironically enough. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the Black Lives Living with Paralysis panel, and so many things came up during that panel. And it was an amazing learning experience just for me, just being a caregiver. I wasn't the actual person living with paralysis, but in a way, not in a way, I really am living with it, because my husband definitely changed my point of view on a lot of things and made me realize that we do need to do a little bit more work to get the information and the resources out to disenfranchised groups and minorities. And it really, really opened my eyes. One of the other things I learned a lot about at the summit was just a lot of disparities as far as medical care. I've got a lot of lofty goals for advocacy coming up. I am working with Kim and Chris to try and learn more about how I can help my community, as well as try and see if we can make some change out there federally. But I would just say reach out to your local community, reach out to your federal representatives. If it wasn't for them, I would not have reached out to my local people, because I thought, oh, well, the best way is to start at the top. No, you don't always have to start at the top. The people in your towns, your aldermen, your mayors, they can help you too. But I just appreciate everything that the Reeve Foundation has done for me and my husband. I really appreciate Chris and Kim for all the help they've offered, and they are a great resource. Utilize them. They don't mind if you email them a million times. If you set up phone calls with them, they are here to help. And thanks again.
Thank you, Felicia. That was that was amazing. And really just a great reminder. I was thinking as you were talking about your correspondence with Congressman Carter's office, you know, that they are really there to work for you, my representative to work for me, to really serve the public, and you know, holding them to account and following up with them, and ensuring that they followed through on what they said they were going to do is part of the job. And you know, for those of you who are not regional champions, you know, if you're more interested in learning about the program, after hearing a little bit about Felicia's experience, I'll be sure to include my email address in the follow-up for you. And you can reach out to me with any questions you might have, or if you want to get involved and you want to put, you know, your email in the chat, I can reach out to you. But really appreciate that, Felicia. It was a great description of why it's so important that we have people working in these communities on behalf of the Paralysis Resource Center. So on that front, I think I might have talked about this in some of my email communication with you in the last few months, but we are actually going to get to our Friday coffee. And it says here that we're going to do it on the third Friday of every month, but actually double checking our Zoom link, it's going to be the fourth Friday. So it'll be June 25th this month at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Whether you like your coffee hot or cold, it's all good. You can come and just hang out. I'll be there. Want to hear about what you're up to outside of the foundation. Want to give you all an opportunity to meet other regional champions, and just do a more informal kind of social gathering so that we can all be together and really open up those lines of communication and connection that we've been missing since the start of this pandemic. So I will also be sending along the Zoom link to those of you who are interested in joining the coffee on June 25th. As Kim mentioned, a couple of upcoming events, which we'll also be sure to send information forward in our follow-up email. The registration for the June 9th Home and Community-Based Services webinar. What are they and why are they important? I'm really looking forward to this one. As John mentioned, you know, it's a key aspect to President Biden's infrastructure plan. It was something that I know other groups that advocate for these types of services were really excited to see that type of investment outlined, and the White House really voicing their support for these programs and what they do for the community. So we'll go into more detail on what they are and why they're important on June 9th at 3 p.m. And the registration link is in the chat now for anyone who wants to just go ahead and sign up right now. And we will also have our 11th annual Walk to Believe. It's a virtual run, walk, and roll. That will be June 12th, starting at 10 a.m. and going to 7 p.m. Through Team LeGrand, Eric LeGrand, great football player from Rutgers University. He has a foundation that does these types of events, and this is a lot of fun. It's a great one. And I think it was virtual for the first time last year and was a great success. So I know we're really happy to see that up and running again this year. So there's the chat, and link in the chat for anyone who's interested in A Walk to Believe. And I'll drop my email address in here for anyone who is interested in reaching out to me. But I appreciate your time. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you to our friends at Waxman Strategies and to everyone who joined us. I just want to double check the Q&A before we sign off, just to make sure we got everybody. It looks like there's one question from someone that has asked, many of our regional champions and many of you are part of many different organizations, and we're just sort of astounded about how much time and energy you have to dedicate to these issues, and we're so appreciative of it. And someone asked, they're part of a different organization, and what should the priorities be for their asks during that time? And I would say, and Chris and John and Celicia, please jump in, but if you're a part of another organization that advocates for disability issues, I always take this as an opportunity to educate people about the Paralysis Resource Center in general, because we don't just serve individuals who have spinal cord injury. We try our best to serve any condition that causes paralysis or mobility impairment. So we can send you a one-pager on this that you can bring with you, but I would really just focus on the Paralysis Resource Center and educating people about what we do and how they can contact us if they need assistance. And so I would just remind that staff person that we are seeking level funding for FY22. So we can send you that as well. I think that is, do you see any other questions? Let's see. Someone asked.
I'll just add to that, Kim. Sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
In regards to what you were saying, if feel free to reach out to me if you need any more information regarding the Paralysis Resource Center, or information on our grants that might have been given out in your state, or anything information that we might have in regards to the Paralysis Resource Center that might help you with these other causes when you go into these meetings. Please feel free to email me, let me know what you need, and I'll do my best to get it to you. So thanks, Kim.
Thank you. And that is the Rare Disease Legislative Caucus. Thank you very much, Deborah, who's a part of many different advocacy organizations. I think and someone else asked, will we get a list of the states of the members that signed on to the Dear Colleague? And Chris will send that out after, so you know who signed on to the Dear Colleague. And I think we covered everything. So if there are no other further questions, I want to thank all my co-panelists. I really want to thank Chris and all of you for joining us today.
Kim, I'll just interject there very quickly at the end.
Sure.
Felicia, thank you so much for your work, for your involvement, for taking on advocacy. I think it's easy for some of us who live and breathe this stuff every day. Sometimes we can get cynical, sometimes we can get overwhelmed by it, and sometimes we can assume that everybody's paying attention to this at the level we are. But I think that it's that kind of engagement, that kind of personal connection that really is the kind of thing that moves policymakers. Buddy Carter is not an easy person to get to support anything federal funding. And so I guarantee that it was the personal connection that you made that with him, with his staff, the fact that they knew you were going to follow up, that they knew you were going to hold them accountable, that made that action get taken. So it really makes a big difference. And when you think about that times 10, or that times 100, or that times 1,000, boy, there's very little limit to what we can do as a community and as a movement. So thank you so much for that. It was really moving.
Thank you. I appreciate you all for everything you do and giving me an opportunity to speak with everyone today, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. I don't think there's any better way to end. So I hope everyone stays safe and is enjoying some warmer weather. And please reach out to us anytime you have questions or you need any information from us. Thanks so much. Stay well.